I sure hope I can edit that out. I don't know what the heck I'm doing. I'm sorry. I meant the globus pallidus. I already said the caudate nucleus. So it's not that it's wrong, it's just that I already said it and didn't need to say it again. So caudate nucleus, putamen, which Putnam turned into putamen in my lab back at UB, and globus pallidus, 3 different structures. For now, we're introducing these two. These particular projections to these areas are important for the initiation of movement. I'm going to start going this way. I'm going to initiate this movement. And we will learn later on how critical that is in some cases with physiology. The other area is this ventral tegmental area. So it's ventral tegmental area. So I bet you can figure out it starts in the ventral tegmentum. And dopamine releasing neurons, cell bodies that live here, project to limbic structures. The limbic structures are really important for emotions and for motivated behaviors, not just emotions, but motivated behaviors that you need to engage to assure your survival. Now, I'm hoping that you've all heard about the limbic system in your introductory psychology courses. It's really important, and we will be talking about it later as we go through the disorders. This system is also what I refer to as the motor for motivated behavior. And the thing is, it's a motor, but we absolutely need somebody to drive that, and we'll see who's doing that in a minute. The dopamine release in this system here at the top it results in that behavioral activation in eating, drinking, sex, escape from noxious stimuli. Noxious means, I think of obnoxious. You don't like it, okay? Stimuli. So if you think about it, those particular behaviors are important for survival. If you have overactivity in the circuit, you end up with some of the positive symptoms of schizophrenia. And again, we will be talking to a fairly big extent, a great extent, about schizophrenia. Okay, now we're going to move out of the midbrain or the mesencephalon, and we're going to move up again. And now we're getting into the section that originally was the forebrain or prosencephalon, into this area, diencephalon. Diencephalon, wow, we've got so many cool things here. Diencephalon includes the thalamus, which is critical for the relay of ascending information, which is sensory, and descending motor information. So kind of think of, remember when we talked about afferent and efferent type of a situation. It actually functions as kind of a switchboard to plug in and decide where to send certain stimuli information. And here again, we have some lumps. And here again, there happens to be 2 lumps here that are called the lateral geniculate nuclei. Genicula comes from genu, which means knee, so it's kind of shaped like that, LGN. And that area of the thalamus is important for taking information from the eyes to the primary visual cortex. That happens to be back here in your occipital lobe. It also includes medial geniculate nuclei, which takes information from the inner ear to the primary auditory complex, which is more up here. Now, I want to go back just a minute and remind you that I talked up before in that directions of the nervous system. Lateral means it's further away from these nuclei are further away from the midline, whereas medial means relative to these nuclei are more medial, closer to the midline. One of the reasons that I kind of made a big deal of those directions. Now here is, any of you who've had me before knows I'm like, hypothalamus, hypothalamus. Hypothalamus is such an amazing structure that has control over so much of your body, your endocrine system. You will learn a little bit more about that later. If you're in biopsychology of stress class now, we are already hitting a lot of that information. So anyway, the hypothalamus is largely in control of the autonomic nervous system. So you're not thinking about this. The hypothalamus is saying, oops, you better do this. The endocrine system. And remember how I said back in that area of the mesolimbic system that we need a driver? We have the motor for behavioral activation for survival behaviors, if you will, if you want to take it to that level, but nobody to drive it. So, you know, you might be activated to do one thing, but it's inappropriate for that circumstance. Here is something that helps out with driving it. And it is responsible for the 4 F's. If you've never heard of the 4 F's, it means, number one, you didn't take my biopsych of stress class ever before, and you haven't encountered it being discussed that way in any other course. Basically, back to those survival things. Stand for feeding, right? Fleeing, if you're being chased by something that you can't deal with on your own, or fighting if you have no other option. So there are 3 of them. The 4th one, by the way, this 4 F's thing was actually invented, or the first time spoken, by a medical student a number of years ago at some university. So I take no credit for this. The 4th F, I'm going to leave to your imagination and just say reproduction, reproductive behavior. I do want to add one more thing. You can write this in if you want. It's not as crucial for this course as it is a couple of my other courses. Freezing behavior. We now know that one of the ultimate effects of sympathetic nervous system activation over time and over extreme crisis is the freezing response. If any of you have ever encountered like a rabbit, a wild rabbit, they will sometimes just freeze. And that is part of this response. Importantly, the hypothalamus is connected to that pituitary gland via something called the infundibular stalk. Sometimes it's referred to as the pituitary stalk for very obvious reasons. The true technical term is infundibular. And that pituitary gland conducts both hormonal messages in the anterior portion and neural messages in the posterior portion. And for a long time, it was said that the pituitary gland is the master gland. Not true. Not true, because the pituitary gland will not be effective, will not release what it should release without the basic commands of the hypothalamus. And so instead of thinking of the pituitary gland as a master gland, think of it more as a mouthpiece of the hypothalamus. Now, I know this is going for a while. You can stop and take a break. I promise when we get through all of these, I will be taking you through some of the visuals in the DVD that is included with your brain book. So if you need to take a break, take a breather. I know this section is a little longer and very just, this is what this is. And I'm trying to explain things the best I possibly can so that you can kind of stay connected to the whole thing. So we're still here in the diencephalon, and we come to the basal ganglia. And remember how I talked about the caudate nucleus? Way more than I should have there a few minutes ago. The basal ganglia is to the left and right of the thalamus, and is comprised of these three major structures: that caudate nucleus, the putamen, and that globus pallidus that I did not have listed before, but it's part of these ganglia, which go back to the special definitions, and you'll see what the ganglia mean, okay? And these do a lot of different things. What I have here is very rudimentary. I just want you to get the basic concepts. So it exchanges information with the cortex. It is very important in the planning of motor sequences of behavior. And the basal ganglia also are part of the structures that are involved with certain aspects of memory and emotional response. There are a lot of diseases that can occur as a result of issues with the basal ganglia. Huntington's disease is only one of those. Okay, a disruption there. We're almost there, guys. Limbic system. Limbic system I talked about before. Motivated and emotional behaviors. And the limbic system consists of a set of structures that actually form a ring around the brain stem. And so start thinking, wow, that could be a good thing, right? And they include the amygdala. Amygdala, amygdala, amygdala. That is like so important if you're thinking about fear, anxiety, and also some aspects of aggression. We're talking about amygdala, which literally means almond. It was almond shaped, so that's how it got that name. Second, super important. Pretty sure, if not positive, you learned all about this in intro psych. The hippocampus. That's a funny name, hippo, and it was given that name because this means seahorse, and somebody looked at it when they discovered that structure and go, oh, it reminds me of a seahorse. When I hear this word, I think more of a hippopotamus. So, but whatever helps you is good. And that is linked to the hypothalamus and plays an important role in memory. So you can imagine that at some point we'll be discussing the hippocampus, an area called the cingulated gyrus of the cerebral cortex, that hypothalamus, which I told you is like so awesome and important of a structure, the septum, which you might have heard of septal range, that comes from this area of the brain, even though what it is important for, as I have listed here, is pleasant and sexual feelings. And then some little structures known as the mammillary bodies. For now, for this and these two, just know that they're part of the limbic system. Ultimately, the limbic system helps the organism feel what is good or what is bad, so that it can perform the right behavior in a complex environment. It is adaptive. It helps you adapt. And again, think about even this amygdala. If you don't have an appropriate fear response to something that definitely can hurt you, something that truly is threatening and threatens your survival, I mean, you need to have that, right? So you need that operational. It is possible in some disorders for it not to be operational to the extent it should be. On the other hand, if you take this amygdala and you overstimulate it, or it responds with fear and anxiety to non-threats, then that's a problem. That's going to be part of what we discuss in more than one mental disorder. So finally, we're to this tau encephalon, and that includes most of the two cerebral hemispheres that you think about. And they're connected by a corpus callosum, which is a wide band of axons. It's the largest band of axons in your brain. It's also known as a commissure. And that is important for taking information from one cerebral hemisphere, okay, to the other cerebral hemisphere. And the cortex is that wrinkly part of your brain. This is where you want wrinkles. If you don't have any wrinkles within your cortex, it means you don't have a lot of cell bodies, you don't have as much cell surface, and so it gives you less area for there to be neuronal connections and responsivity, etc. That cortex in these areas, which again, I'll go to a diagram in a moment, have large grooves, and I'll point that out in a moment. And then small grooves that are actually between the gyri, which are bulges in between the grooves. These particular characteristics of the human cortex actually tend to enlarge the surface area of our cortex about 3 times. And basically 2/3 of the surface of our cortex, it's supposed to be an eye, sorry, is hidden within these grooves and bumps, okay? And also there's the glia and cell bodies that are both involved and present in the cortex. Okay, let me scooch down here for a minute. I'm going to finish through these lobes before I even move on to that DVD section and just review all the different parts with you. But lobes of the cortex, remember, we're the telencephalon, and that cortex includes lobes, 4 lobes, and the lobe that's at the back here is called your occipital lobe. And that lobe, those cells and that area of your cortex receives input from visual pathways, particular primary visual cortex is the area within here. If you damage this section, you can end up with cortical blindness. That means your optic nerve is intact, your eyes themselves are intact, you have no degeneration. But because this area of your brain cannot receive that information in a way it can make sense of it and then pass it on, it is as if you are blind. So that shows how important all of these cortical areas are in taking what we perceive to be very base level aspects of our behaviors and senses. If you've ever done this, and I've done it probably more than I want to admit, fallen backwards and hit the back of your head and saw stars, those flashes of light basically indicate activation of cell bodies in your primary visual cortex. for a while when I was in my teenage years. I was like the only girl on the whole street, and I lived, you know, out a ways. So we would all get together, and I just did everything that all the guys in the neighborhood did, including playing ice hockey on a pond, basically a cow pond in the area. And so I fell on the ice a few times. Yep. And guess what? I saw some stars more than once. Anyway, parietal lobes. If you take your hands and you go, oh no, you are putting your hands on your parietal lobes. And these lobes are essential for the processing of body sensations, other information, but so essential for integrating modalities, taking information from two different sensory modalities or more, combining them so what gets sent to your cortex is more complete. Temporal lobe. Temporal lobe are your temples. I love this. See, if I made all of these areas names up, that's what I would have done. Oh, you say we have a temple area. Okay, let's call this a temporal lobe. Love it. Anyway, it's a target for auditory information. The left temporal lobe, particularly in most people, and not completely and not in every person, but generally is thought of as being important for the understanding of spoken language. It also houses the more complex aspects of vision. Remember how I said that your optic nerve and the information from your eyes is going to travel back to your occipital lobe, and there the primary visual cortex is going to kind of take things and send it on so it can be integrated and synthesized by other areas. And so in this place we see more complex aspects of vision. So I want to mention, and these will again come up more so in my neuropsychology course in the spring, Fundamentals of Human Neuropsychology, but it's important to know too for this course. Agnosia means failure to recognize. And this failure of recognition is not because you have a sensory deficit, something wrong with your eyes, or a verbal or an intellectual impairment. So it has something to do with the more complex aspects, the integration of information from areas of your brain, including your PVC. And this, just think gnostic, that means to know. That's a Greek word you should be familiar with. Trust me, this can happen. That can definitely help you on like your GREs. A means away from or without. So without knowledge. Now, let's say you can recognize most things, but you can't recognize faces specifically. I mean, you could come in and sit in the same chair if we were in the classroom, and I wouldn't be able to recognize your face. Even if I saw it every day, I would learn that you sat there, but that is something I would have to do to help me. Recognition of faces, you don't have recognition, of faces, that's prosopagnosia. Think front, pro area. And if you can't perceive objects, generally, that's just basically called visual agnosia, because you can't see and perceive them. That is why I really ask you, I posted the pages specifically that I want you to read in that little book by Oliver Sacks. It is a great little paperback, and each chapter is not super long and talks about a case study, and it is by one of the best people in this field ever. So please do that so you can, you know, really recognize what this is. There's some really cool parts in that. So sometimes in class I would read parts of it out, but don't think I'm going to do that here. So this area plays a role in emotional and motivational behaviors. And also we have that rhinal fissure, which is another deep groove. And that area, that groove actually separates the very ancient cortex, the cortex that is present in, more primitive species and has was there for a long time, primitive. From the neocortex, which is the more recently developed part of your cortex. And last but not least is the frontal lobe. That receives input from all sensory modalities, all of them. And it's also the place or the seat of higher cognitive processes that include working memory, things like social inhibition, trying to planning sequences, thinking of what you have to do and actually being able to execute things, executive function. It also plays a role in emotional expression. And I believe you have all heard about Phineas Gage. I mean, what about the effects of this huge tamping iron that goes through his head, and he lives. And this was back when they tamped these things with gunpowder in to lay the railways for the railroad. I will post a little extra resource for you if you've never heard about Phineas. Wow. And Phineas Gage, long story short, after this accident that basically took out a bunch of his frontal lobe, changed. He went from this pleasant, hardworking guy to this very obnoxious, aggressive, using poor language. And by poor, I don't mean the grammar wasn't right. So that was like an accidental case study from which we learned a lot. I'm going to pause here for a moment. I am going to try to put on the DVD. So take a breather. This is a little review. We're going to be wrapping up this lecture in just a very few minutes. Okay, to finish up with this lecture, I would like to take a moment and bring up this DVD that I thought I had all ready to go, and for some reason it's being bad. So give me 1 second here, and we will start. So this, if you bought this Human Brain book, which I'm telling you is a buy, it's one of the best buys that you could make, and it contains that DVD. What I'm going to be showing you is from that. I'm going to move to this anatomy of the brain, and I'm going to look at the whole brain, and I'm going to use the side view because I think it's the easiest one to kind of relate to in terms of looking at the different structures I talked about. And I love this. I just absolutely love this deal. I guess I like interaction. Maybe I am a child, I don't know. But here is that spinal cord, and then as you move up, here is that medulla that we talked about in the myencephalon. And that medulla regulates vital functions. Let's move up. Here's that pons that is like basically a bridge of nerve fibers, but also is important for some aspects of arousal. So let me, here is the thalamus. Remember, I called it kind of a switchboard, and It processes and sends on sensory information to higher brain areas, but it also has descending fibers as well. Let's go here. My hypothalamus. Look at the size relative to the rest of the brain, and yet it controls the autonomic nervous system and the endocrine system. And so you can see its relationship to the thalamus. I'm going to try to figure out, here's that pituitary gland. You can see it is connected to the hypothalamus. They're not really going to show you the connection here, but I think you can visualize that, and we'll talk more about that later. Here's that corpus callosum. Now, remember, this is like a band of axons. We have cut the brain for this view completely down the midline, right in half. So I could take this hemisphere and this hemisphere and go like this. So this is what we would see on the inside if we looked at one hemisphere from this aspect. Let's see what else I want to show you up here. Here are those meninges I talked about. Scalp, I think you can figure that out. And the skull, I think you got that as well. I'm just trying to make it go. Dura mater and the arachnoid, that superior sagittal sinus, sometimes called, let's go here, above, it's an area above the arachnoid, and then here is the dura mater and arachnoid together. It's eventually in, and I'm not seeing where they have it here. I thought they did. There's the pia mater. Oh, yay, I found it. That's the innermost layer. It's the innermost meninx. So if you want to look at a different view of it, you have options. Here is the front view once it actually loads. So this is blowing your brain in half and coming up here. So you can still see all of those structures just from a different perspective. Okay. I'm going to go back here for a minute, and I want to look at this pituitary gland and the hypothalamus. And for now, what I want you to know is here are nuclei. You can see different ones. All of these comprise that hypothalamus. And then here's the pituitary stalk or infundibular stalk. And you can see the anterior portion has all these vessels that actually are continuous from the hypothalamus. And the thing is, the hypothalamus sends hormones called releasing and inhibiting hormones down to this portion of the pituitary gland, which then goes, oh, that means I should send out my own hormone in response. Whereas the posterior portion is neural. Your hypothalamus makes or synthesizes the hormones that are going to be released by your posterior pituitary. Okay, so it basically sends them down an axon into the posterior pituitary, which activates the release of that oxytocin and ADH. I'm really hoping that that is useful in looking at the structures. I also want to show you, I mean, I love looking at imaging. Love it, love it, love it. And this is a way you can actually go through an MRI, a real MRI, and see how it changes as you move through farther, going up, across, or down, back. And finally, I want to point you to this. I did put that link in for you for that like 4.5 minute or so YouTube video about this, but here is another resource for you. And it just kind of shows the development through here in some capacities. Okay, so hopefully these various visuals will help you and as you move on. And the very last thing, and then you have gotten through all this and we'll be starting neurophysiology, yay, is going back to your outline. The spinal cord, and again, I just want you aware of these ideas just so that you know what I'm talking about if I mention it. And that spinal cord, there's two areas, an inner H-shaped area of gray matter, that's cell bodies and interneurons, and there's dorsal horns, that means the back, vertical horns means the front. That's supposed to be ventral. Just saw that, sorry guys. I don't know if I can go back, maybe I can edit that after I process this whole thing. I'll let you know. Like I said, this is not a practice and stop and be gone and, you know, let me stop and cut and after an hour go back and do the whole thing over again. This is me making mistakes. And the surrounding area of white matter that we're going to see in the illustration is actually composed of myelinated axons or tracts. Remember, bundles of axons in the central nervous system are referred to as tracts. That was also your kind of special definition areas. And I have in here the idea about the different parts and the axons are sensory when you're coming in the back. And what I try to do is go, okay, information that's coming from outside, sensory information, it's like a burglar is going to come in your back door, open the door, look, nobody's there. I'm going to come in and I'm sensing, I'm the sensory part. But then there's the ventral root that comes from your ventilation, your front, your chest. And these axons are motor or afferent, which means all of a sudden somebody says, oh my God, you're in here, and goes to chase them, and that activates a motor response, and so he runs out your front door. This is the illustration that I was talking about. These are the horns that contain the cell bodies, and here is the white matter, which are tracts of myelinated axons, okay? Hopefully this has come together for you. Again, I'm going to, in the very near future, have a synchronous Zoom class meeting during class time. One of the reasons I said, please reserve that time for that and oral exams and other things. And you can ask me questions about anything that's unclear. Also, I'll post a discussion post for this particular, the whole nervous system lecture series. The only thing is sometimes the questions are a little tough to ask on there, and if possible, I'd love to answer them kind of in person, synchronous, okay? So that is what we have for now. You've had a lot of information this first real full week. We started last week, of course, but this is kind of a shorter week, and hopefully you will be able to find time to get through this information, and I can start working ahead a little bit. I'm trying very hard because I got behind due to all the issues I kind of mentioned before. Anyway, have a good rest of your day. I hope this makes sense, and I wish I could be like there using my hands and showing you things in person, but this is the best we can do right now.